Good evening, everyone. We're picking up tonight in Psalm 132. Psalm 132. We're continuing in this selection of psalms called the Songs of Ascent. And most of these are anonymous. Some of them we have an author for. And this one maybe is a little bit tricky here. In verse 1, it says, "Remember, Lord, in David's behalf, all of his affliction." And so you might just see the name David and immediately think this is a psalm by David. But if you read that again, that's not necessarily what it's saying, right? It says, remembering David's affliction, not necessarily by David, right? So this psalm, although there are some that say of David or by David, this one is simply remembering David's afflictions. It's not actually specifically calling out who the author is here. And as a matter of fact, the way it reads, it's really someone telling you about David. So I would argue that it is most likely not written by David himself. As a matter of fact, if you look at the content of this psalm as you go through it, it was most likely written sometime during Solomon's reign. Skipping ahead here just for a minute, in verses 8 to 10, we have this reference to Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. And so if you jump down there just briefly, it says, "Arise, Lord, to your resting place, you in the ark of your strength. May your priests be clothed with righteousness, and may your godly ones sing for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed." So those verses right there kind of give us a little bit of a reference of when this might have taken place. It's speaking of the coming of the ark to Jerusalem. That's also being referenced there. So it gives us a little bit of a hint of when it was written. But to go back to verse 1 here, remember, Lord, in David's behalf, all of his affliction. Okay? So the psalmist is beginning by entreating God, by asking God to recall everything that David suffered. So, just as a little recap here, what were a few of the things that David suffered? What were some of David's afflictions? Rick?
Saul tried to spear him at least once, right?
Saul tried to spear him at least once, right? That's one. What else? This is kind of like a dealer's choice. There are many to choose from, right? Pat?
He had to go in hiding with his men. He was very hungry.
He had to go in hiding with his men. He was very hungry, right? The Amalekites, yeah. There's some big ones, right? Like Goliath. Right? That was a trial that he went through. The suffering and everything that came with Bathsheba. At multiple times, he was despised and criticized by his family. Many life and death struggles that he went through. He was accused of treason and treachery. Again, the scandal that he went through. In his later years, his son staged a coup. And then that was followed by a civil war. So this is just generalizing, right? David suffered quite a bit. There were quite a few afflictions that he went through. And so the psalmist is beginning by asking God to remember these things that David went through. And asking the reader or the listener to also recall these things and remember them. So this is where we want to begin, is remembering these afflictions, okay? But then the psalmist also is going to recall a specific oath that David made, okay? Let's read verses 2 to 5. It says, "How he swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob, I certainly will not enter my house nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob." So first, the psalmist asks us to remember the things that David suffered. And then he asks us to remember this oath that David made. And sum it up. What is this oath that David makes here?
He wants to have a temple built.
He wants to build a temple. right? He wants to build a dwelling place for the Lord, right? He wants to build this temple. And he says that he would not rest in his own house until he finds a dwelling place for the Lord. And if you want to read that full story there, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So I think a reasonable question then is, did David fulfill that oath? His son did? Rick?
Well, he found the place, he just was not allowed to build the temple.
He found the place he was not allowed to build?
He had the area,
Yep.
and Solomon came and built the temple.
Yep, I agree with that. Yes, David did not build the temple. That happened in Solomon's time, right? God did not permit David to build the temple. But he did locate the place for it, right? Shirley?
I think I just read where he also dedicated some of these things to the temple.
That's right. He spent a lot of time preparing the way for Solomon, gathering building materials and other things like that, and essentially setting the stage so that when someone who was permitted could take over, they had everything that they needed and they were ready to do it. So David did the full extent that God permitted him to do, pretty much.
You know what it reminds me of?
Yeah, go ahead.
It reminds me of John the Baptist in Christ, because John the Baptist prepared the way.
Right, yeah. Just like John the Baptist prepared the way for Jesus, we see David preparing the way for Solomon in this occasion, right? Now, again, just for some context from the rest of the Old Testament, we can see how David fulfills this oath. Because remember, he said that he would not rest in his own house until he fulfilled this oath, okay? So that was the second part of it. Not just finding a place, but also not resting in his own house until he came through with that. And we can go to to 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 43. And we see that he did not bless his own house, and therefore he did not inhabit it until the ark was brought to Zion, where the temple would eventually be. So until he located that place, he did not bless his own house to go and to inhabit it. That was their custom there. So you bless this house and then it's ready to inhabit. That's like the final step. Pat?
Was the ark at Shiloh at this time?
I wrote down where the ark was at, and I think we're going to get into that in a few verses. So just hold on to that.
Somebody's house.
Yeah. I have that further in the slides, I think. So just hold on to that. Before we get too far into that, though, notice the title that the psalmist calls God. God has many titles and names that people refer to him by. This time, the psalmist calls God the Mighty One of Jacob. So, does anyone know where that comes from? Well, who's Jacob? Right? Israel, right? Yeah, this is going all the way back to Genesis chapter 49 and verse 24. Hold your finger there in Psalms and then turn over to Genesis chapter 49 and verse 24. And it reads, but his bow remained firm and his arms were agile from the hands of the Mighty One of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Okay, so it's referring all the way back to that verse. It's referencing other parts of the Old Testament there. So, verse 6, I skipped too far ahead. Verse 5. Sorry. When you have too many Psalms, it's easy to get into the wrong one. All right, there we go. Verse 6. So we see this oath that he's made. We see that David fulfills this, and he's referencing the Mighty One of Jacob. Again, a title for God being the God of Israel. And then in verse 6, it says, behold, we heard about it from Ephrathah. We found it in the field of Jar. Okay, so some different names here that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But this verse seems to be referring to the ark when he says, behold, we heard about it. The it being the ark. That's what it seems to be referring to. And we'll give you a few reasons why. Okay? So, the ark, if you trace the ark's history throughout the Old Testament, the ark was, at this point in time, it was in this city called Kiriath Jearim, I think. It was also called Bala. I'm doing my best to pronounce those names. And it had been brought there and basically rested there for about 20 years. And you can refer to multiple verses to kind of follow that story and to see where the ark ultimately ends up. So through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, it shows you that this journey. Now, this first word, Ephrath, this is the ancient name of another well-known city. You all know it. So anybody have an idea of what that is? Bethlehem, right. Ephrath is the ancient name of Bethlehem. Although in this particular instance, it could also refer to Ephraim. Okay? And Shiloh is a town in the lot of Ephraim. And so the ark was captured by Philistines here. I'll pull up a map in just a minute. So the psalmist is either saying, we heard about the ark in Ephrath, or Bethlehem, where David spent much of his youth, or he's saying we heard about it at Ephraim, which is also called Shiloh, where the ark was lost. So he's saying one of these two things, when he says, behold, we heard about it, the ark, and he's saying we heard about it at one of these two places. Okay? Now we'll read a little bit further to find some more clues. It could also be, though, that we're splitting hairs with that, right? Because both of these places were actually in a very close vicinity to one another.
Yeah, I was just thinking that name Ephrath or whatever, I thought that meant, I mean, it does include Bethlehem, but I really thought it meant that little area.
Right, and he could be also saying that, like, these two places are not far apart. This could all be referring to one general region. Okay, so it could be this is a case of just splitting the hairs too far. Judges gives us a very specific example or a very specific description of this location. So Judges chapter 21 and verse 19 says, so they said, behold, there is the feast of the Lord from year to year in Shiloh, which is on the north side of Bethel. Okay, on the east side of the road, which goes up from Bethel to Shechem, on the south side of Lebonah. And this is the map. So this is tracing the path of the journey that the ark goes on before it finally comes to rest in Jerusalem. So it's lost up here. It goes on this long journey, right? Because the Philistines had captured it. And then it kind of goes through some of these different cities. Ultimately, it stops here at Kiriath Jearim for 20 years. It's in this general area. And then it finally makes its way to Jerusalem. Okay? Another image of a map here, just to try and show you how close these are. The top red circle is Shiloh. The next one down is Bethel. And then the next one down is Kiriath Jearim. Okay? So again, in Judges chapter 21 and verse 19, it explains some of these places to us. Now there's one more location that we need to take note of. Depending on which translation you're using, it reads a little different. In the New American Standard, it says, we found it in the field of Jar. Okay? If you're reading the King James or the New King James, it says, we found it in the fields of the woods. Well, Kiriath Jearim translates to the city of jars. Does anybody want to hazard a guess of what jars are? Woods, right? Jar equals woods. So it's all saying the same thing. The ark was found at Kiriath Jearim, the city of the woods. We found it in the fields of the woods, the field of Jar. Kiriath Jearim. It's saying we found the ark in a field near this city. That's what it's saying. So if you go back one more time and you read verse 6, it says, "Behold, we heard about it," the ark, "in Ephrath. We found it in the field of Jar." Okay? All of this is just telling us where they heard about this ark. Because remember, David said right before this, he swore this oath that he would not inhabit his own house until the ark, or until he found a dwelling place for the Lord, right? Until he found that place. That's how this all ties together. So just a quick recap of the Psalms so far. David suffered many afflictions, but he was a man after God's own heart. David swears this oath to find God a dwelling place. David recovers the ark and brings it to Jerusalem, right? David suffers a lot, but he's got a good spirit, a good heart. He makes a promise, and then he goes and does the promise. This is the point of the psalm so far. And it's just got a little bit of history wrapped up in there, a few locations to show us that David, in fact, did what he said. So I'll pause there for just a second. Any questions? I can always go back to the map. Okay. Dave's usually the one who's giving you the geography lesson, not me. So verse 7. The psalmist says, "Let's go into his dwelling place. Let's worship at his footstool." Okay, let's go into his dwelling place. Well, now we're seeing how this all ties together, right? David wanted to find a place for the Lord to dwell, and now the psalmist is saying, let's go there. It's been found. It happened. I just reviewed that history with you. Now let's go there. Let's go to this place. So he's saying, after a brief history on how the temple, God's dwelling place, came to be, he's encouraging everyone, let's go there. Let's go visit this place. And he says, let's worship at his footstool. Okay? What's God's footstool? Where's that? The Ark of the Covenant is sometimes called that. What about more broadly, more general? The earth, right? He's referring to it as the ark, though, in this case. So you're right. But I just did want to call out that sometimes it is a little bit more broad. So in verse 7, again, piecing this all together, whenever we take a deep dive, let's not lose track of what the overall psalm is trying to tell us. The psalmist is saying, let's go worship God, remembering how we got to this place, right? David was faithful. David made a promise. David fulfilled that promise. The temple's now here. Let's go worship God there. Now, again, about the footstool. This is what the Lord says. Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool for my feet. Where then is a house you could build for me? And where is a place that I may rest? Isaiah 66 and verse 1. When we think about how this psalm relates to us, the ark's not around, the temple's not around. We don't talk about the city of the field of woods or Ephrath. We don't talk about things like that, right? That's nice history, but how does any of that apply to you and me today? Well, the whole point of this so far is remembering where we came from. The psalmist is saying, let's go worship God, remembering how we got to this point. So for you and me, that lesson still applies, right? We're in this building and we're worshiping God. How did you and I get here? How did you and I end up at this point, right? That's something to reflect on. Think about all the history that happens after this that we can read about in the Bible, all the way up to the coming of Jesus, all the way up to his death. to his resurrection, to his ascension, to reading about the disciples that he had who were faithful and helped the church out afterwards, reading about the apostles and the work that they did, all the way up to the book of Revelation. Then we can think about our personal journey that we took to become Christians, to be sitting here today studying God's Word. And we think about where we are at. We are still at God's footstool. We're still here on earth. We're still worshiping at his footstool, hoping one day to be in his presence in heaven. So that's how this ties together for modern day Christians. We are worshiping at his footstool. We are worshiping him on earth. So his people are still worshiping him in the same way today. Now, verse 8, it says, "Arise, Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength." So we have the ark mentioned here again. Well, we just talked about how the ark got to where it needed to be. Now he's asking the Lord to dwell there. Now that the ark is where it needs to be, please dwell there, right? We want the presence of the Lord to be here. We want to be in his presence. And then, of course, the ark of your strength is another reference to the ark of the covenant. So now we have God where we hope that he will be, right? In our midst, dwelling there. We want him to be there. And so he says in verse 9, "May your priests be clothed with righteousness, and may your godly ones sing for joy." So let's look at that. May your priests be clothed in righteousness. Does anyone remember how the Old Testament priests were arrayed? Just in general, you don't need specifics. Matt?
Special linen garments.
Yeah, there was, if you go back and you read in the first 5 books of the Bible, it was very specific, right? Special linens and garments. Rick?
They had to have that chest piece.
There was that chest piece, yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of special...
A turban for their head or something.
There was a special kind of head covering. There were a lot of and it was all written out in specifics, right? The gemstones and how it was decorated, everything was spelled out. It was very clear that they had to be dressed up a certain way.
I believe that was the high priest.
The high priest, yeah.
Each one of the stones represented one of the tribes of Israel.
Yeah. So then my question to you is, what about God's priests today? In 1 Peter chapter 2, at the beginning of verse 9, it says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood." So God still has priests today. And that's you and me, right? Sometimes it's weird to think about yourself being a priest, right? That's the earthly idea of what a priest is not what we are, right? It's not how we appear. But we are still a priesthood. We are still a royal priesthood. How, then, are we to be arrayed? How should God's priests today be dressed? How should we be clothed? Rachel?
In humbleness and with all of the pieces of the armor of God, breastplate of righteousness.
The full panoply of God, right? All the different parts. Yep. Matt?
And the text here says the priests should be clothed with righteousness, and certainly we should as well, and we can talk about how it relates to being clothed with Christ.
Yep. Pat?
Also, we're supposed to put on the whole armor of God.
Yep. The whole armor of God, the full panoply of God, clothed in righteousness, clothed in Christ. Shirley?
Or less, she said, what?
Same thing? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, there are several verses that you can look at. You've all mentioned a few of them. This is one, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 27. For all of you who were baptized into Christ, Christians, have clothed yourselves with Christ. Okay? So a Christian who is to be a royal priest should be clothed with Christ. Right? Another verse, This is going back to the full armor of God. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 14. Having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Specifically calling out this piece of armor here because it calls out righteousness. Okay? So we, as a royal priesthood, we as priests should be clothed in righteousness. When we put on Christ, Christ is righteous. We need to be righteous. And so the psalmist, back in Old Testament times, was saying, may God's priests be clothed in righteousness, right? May they do what they're supposed to do. May they be clean and presentable and holy before God. So should we still be today, right? This is a spiritual aspect. This isn't a specific linen or an ephod or a chest piece that we need. These are talking about spiritual aspects of ourselves, right? And then it says, and may your godly ones sing for joy. The godly ones being God's people. Again, that's us. We should also sing for joy. And we see this in James chapter 5 and verse 13. Is anyone cheerful? He is to sing praises, right? One proper response to being happy by being God's people, to be joyful about it, is to sing praises. So when we sing, this is one way that we are expressing our joy to God. This is a way that we praise him. This is a way that we worship him. And we see it's something that can be seen in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There are so many parallels between them, right? So we see this continued here. I'll pause for a second. Any questions, thoughts, or comments before we continue?
My thought is you should sing with your whole heart because God is in our midst.
Right. Yeah, we're supposed to be that way, right? We should be singing praises. We should be singing with our whole heart, right? Loving God with all of our being. Body, heart, mind, soul, all of that, right?
I think of Paul and Silas when they were singing in prison.
Yeah.
They sang with their heart and soul.
Yeah, that's another good example of Paul and Silas singing in the prison, right? So in verse 10, the psalmist goes on, and he says, for the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed. The Lord has sworn to David, a truth from which he will not turn back. I will set upon your throne one from the fruit of your body. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I will teach them, their sons also will sit upon your throne forever. So earlier in the psalm, we talked about David making an oath to God. He made a promise to God, right? To find a place for the ark to rest. Now, the psalmist is asking God to remember his promise to David. What did God promise to David? What was that promise? Rick?
Basically, what you see here is that the throne would be his and his, Solomon followed him, and it would be his and his son's throne.
Right.
It would be,
The throne would stay in the line of David, right? Did God follow through on that? Yeah. Well, he said forever, right? So who's sitting on the throne now then on the line of David? Christ, right? This is a promise about the coming of Jesus. And again, this is a key theme for the Psalms that we are in right now, which is thinking of Christ, pointing our minds towards Christ. These specific Psalms are focusing a lot on that promise that Jesus was coming. They didn't know his name was Jesus at that time, but they were looking forward to the Messiah, to this promised kingdom, right? They were looking forward to that. And so you can refer to that whole promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7, specifically verses 12 to 16, that the Messiah would come from David's line. And that, again, once Jesus came, he would be the final king, right? He's the one who's on the throne now. He is the Messiah. In Acts chapter 2, verses 30 to 31, it says, so because he, meaning David, was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on the throne, he looked ahead and he spoke of the resurrection of Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades nor did his flesh suffer decay. So just in case it wasn't super clear and you thought, well, maybe God just was talking about, the actual descendants of David and it's just his sons being on the throne, and that means that somewhere in the world there should be a throne with a descendant of David. No, he's speaking of Christ. David was speaking as a prophet in this part. The resurrection of Christ. He looked ahead and he spoke of the resurrection of Christ. This promise is speaking about Jesus. So we can see that in multiple places here. In verse 13, it says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it as his dwelling place." I don't think anyone really needs to see this, but in case you didn't realize it, Zion is Jerusalem, right? That's what he's talking about here. Psalm 78, verse 68, "But he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved." What tribe was David from? Judah, right? Judah. So this is referring not only to a place, but a people. Now, again, what's the application for Christians today? Well, we are looking towards a heavenly city. We're not looking towards an earthly Zion, but a heavenly Zion, right? The Hebrew author in chapter 12, verse 22, he says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." That's the city that we're looking to. We are looking forward to the heavenly Zion. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, it says, "God's house now is not the earthly temple in Jerusalem, but the church." Right? That's what we as God's people are looking for. We are looking forward to that. We are looking forward to the future, to Jesus coming back, to going to heaven, to a heavenly place. All right. We are at the end of our time for tonight. We've got a little bit further to go in Psalms 132. So if you haven't already, go ahead and read forward for that for next week. And Lord willing, as long as the weather holds nice, we'll go over that then next week. Thank you, everyone.